Over the past year, I've really devoted a lot of my time to fiction writing and trying to understand it. So when I was thinking about putting together just a panel of guests to interview here on this podcast, one person came to mind, and that's Risa Fey. Risa's been a very active member within my community, and I found it so intriguing that she's a multi-genre author who has been very prolific. Everything from writing, doggo books, as we'll discuss inside the interview, to dark fantasy to horror. And I wanted to kind of understand a little bit more about her process for writing fiction, and more importantly, within a series. So this is a fun, deep dive into the craft of writing and also getting a Bookbub deal. For crying out loud, Bookbub, what gives? But that's another question for another day. So why don't we go ahead and get into today's interview with a good friend of mine, Risa Fey. Risa, how did you get your start in writing and publishing?
Well, I started just through KDP, and in 2015, I had been resistant to the idea of indie publishing for a long time because I was kind of a snob. And when I finally got over that hurdle, I saw a lot of people who were succeeding at publishing their books. I decided to write some stuff and just put it out there, and
So
I was sold
you were saying you're a snob. How so were you a snob? Tell me.
You indie authors, you're just, the old, it's not so much, what's the word I'm looking for, where people don't really respect it, or they really did not respect it back then especially, and I kind of saw it that way. If you're not published with a publishing house, you're not a real author, and I wanted to be a real author. And now that I've come to where I'm at, even though I'm not making a bunch of money or anything, it seems like the reverse now. Like owning your own business.
Opposite.
Yes, yeah. Yeah.
What was the change? Like, what was the thing that tipped you over to like, okay, I don't want to go to the trad pub route. I'm going to do the self-pub route.
Education, actually. So seeing how everybody was succeeding in their own way, and I'm not just talking about making a lot of money, but owning their product and being able to change it last minute and having the freedom to write what they want. And that really sold me. Plus, a lot of people were making a decent amount of money. And I never have actually gotten to that point. I made rent one time on 1 month. And when I hit a Bookbub promotion, but yeah.
That's really cool. Bookbub, by the way, is nothing easy to hit, and let's tap on that really quick, because I have applied to Bookbub time and time again. I've got great covers, great descriptions, good reviews, but I think maybe my timing's always off. What was the secret to you landing that Bookbub deal?
I have no idea. I submitted my horror novel, and there was nothing special about it. The reviews were hit and miss. Like, it was not even a 4.0 star rating on my product, and I did not have a bunch of ratings, but they accepted me, they booked me, and that month I made enough money to pay my rent off of the 99-cent sales that I made, and it took off. And so I've been trying to send in my first in series urban fantasy, and I cannot. I've sent it in probably about 50 times already, and I keep getting rejected. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you know, is there anything that you did differently the first time that you got accepted and that you're doing now?
I think it was my first submission. I did not try even 3 times with that book. I know that for sure. I think they accepted it on my first submission, though. I don't know. I can't say.
Amazing. So you must have hit a really good timing on something like that.
I think so. And when I watched their newsletter, I noticed that it doesn't seem like they're judging it based on the book covers necessarily, because a lot of the book covers are, they're not impressive. So I do try to aim for professionalism and making it as attractive as possible, but
Gotcha. Now, okay, when you and I first met, you were publishing the Doggo book series. This is adorable,
Yes.
like humorous pet series type thing. That's
Right.
how I kind of got to know you. I remember one of the times I looked at your description as I was reading it, and it was in the voice of your Doggo character. And I was like, I was so confused. I was like, what's going on here? And I'm like, oh, this is a whole like sub niche. Well, you were really deep into that. Like you have, I'd say how many, like half a dozen of those books? Like there's a lot in that series, right?
Yeah, there was 8 short stories, I think, and that's right there. Yeah.
Nice.
8 short stories, and I compiled them all into a novel. So they're as long as a novel, and I thought it was going to be a big hit. I ran some Facebook ads, and people were really interested. There was a lot of interaction on the ads, a lot of comments, loves, likes, shares, but nobody was buying it. And I think because it was such a sub niche, and nobody wants to read something that it honestly made my brain hurt writing them. So I can imagine it would make people's brains hurt reading it. Wow, that was difficult to say. Yeah.
It was so funny. I remember you even saying that, how you had to put yourself into this character that had a specific dialect because you're thinking in the form of the actual pet itself.
Right.
I thought it was very creative. And speaking of creative, you decided, okay, you went from the Doggo series, this adorable, fun-loving series, to all of a sudden you go to these darker horror books. Why did you pivot?
Actually, the Doggo Tales series was more of the pivot. It was a labor of love, kind of just something I was not expecting to make money off of. And it was just for my dog, who was really helping me ground myself in my life after my mom passed away. So the dark books were what I really wanted to write. And that's where my true passion was, getting into psychology, insanity, madness, and Lovecraftian monsters, all that stuff. So, yeah.
That is really cool. What is one lesson you learned the hard way in your transition of working in the Doggo books to doing dark fantasy horror books?
They're not going to cross-sell. People who are interested in one thing are not interested in the other thing. So, but another difficult thing was you do have to take the time. I think, at least in my case, you do have to take the time to get that labor of love, that one project that you just want to work on, and it's probably not going to make any money. You do have to get it out of your system, at least in my case. And that's time consuming. It's frustrating because I want to be successful income-wise right away. I want to have a following right away, but I really had to get some things out of my system. So, yeah.
Interesting. So you mentioned a name here, and I've seen your work compared to the likes of this. Pretty much one of the goats of horror writing in H.P. Lovecraft. What drew you to the work of H.P. Lovecraft, and how has that shaped you as an author?
I was drawn to him because he seems to capture human psychology, the darker aspects of that, mental illness, so well, and he represents it well through the use of his gods, his monsters. And he's probably the first horror author that I ever read, and I was truly terrified when I read his stories. He gave me the honest-to-God heebie-jeebies, and I knew he struck a nerve with something in the human psyche that I thought was worth exploring. And I think I might have missed part of the question there, but I'll leave it there if you wanted more clarification.
No, this is good because I wanted to kind of figure out like why you like H.P. Lovecraft and if that is infused in your writing. So you covered it pretty well. What piece of work do you find most inspiring of Lovecraft?
Oh my goodness, all of them, honestly. I can't pick, but I think the one I would choose if I had to, it's kind of obvious, the Call of Cthulhu. So that was my entry point, and I was sold at that point.
I noticed that's your profile picture over on Amazon Author, is the multiple tentacles on the face and such. It's really cool.
Yeah.
So, all right, now how was your approach when writing a book series? Because you have this entire series that you've built out over your dark horror series. So tell me, how does that look?
So I think you're talking about my urban fantasy, and it has
Okay.
horror elements. It's not actually a horror, but
Okay.
oh, and the one I'm working on now, I think you're referring to that one. Yes. How am I approaching it? So I approach it as the first book needs to be able to function as a standalone, if and every book needs to function as a standalone afterwards, in case I need to abort the project for whatever reason. If it's just not working for me, or if I need to start a different project because there's a new opportunity. But with this one, the Destroyer series, I have Destroyer of Sorrows, which I'm rewriting completely now, and Destroyer of Serpents. I'm approaching it from they're all their own story, and it's inspired by the Hebrew Bible, and
Okay.
I have a leg up there because the Hebrew Bible is filled with a bunch of stories that could be told by themselves, but they're all interconnected. Each one could be its own entry point. So that's kind of my angle with that.
Nice. Are you, when you go into writing, are you a strict plotter, or as Joanna Penn calls it, a discovery writer, aka a pantser?
Yeah. A fusion. So I definitely will plot the basic flow of the story. So my plotting will not be, it'll be between 1,000 to 4,000 words probably. And then everything else, the characters take over, the environment takes over, the Lovecraftian monsters really mess things up. They take over, and I let it change the story as it needs to. I don't worry about the beginning of my stories, my first chapters, because they always change. So it's a throwaway chapter for me until I begin my editing process. And I never plot my endings, because every time I have tried to plot an ending or say, this is my ending point, this is what I'm heading towards, it changes every single time. So I gave up on that because I ended up wasting a lot of time, like months, 3 months, 4 months, trying to force something to work at the end, when the characters, the trajectory of the story is leading me to something else. And when I finally started trusting that process, it freed me up so much. So yeah.
It's a really interesting approach to things. I like that. I know just breaking into fiction, one of the things I just do is I do have a rough idea of where I'm starting, but where I'm finishing, I always leave it open-ended. So it's reassuring to know there's somebody else out there who's doing the same thing, because
Right.
I don't want to paint myself into a corner if I think of something midway through. That's the way I've always been. Now,
Exactly.
you're doing a series, and obviously there's a lot of characters at play. There's a lot of different environmental things, a lot of world building that's involved. How do you track all your characters and their profiles and their traits and specific, devices that you're using in one story that you want to move over to the next story?
I'm not as organized in that area as I hear some authors are, but I do keep a notepad, the notepad option on your PC computer.
Uh-huh.
I just open that up, and as I'm writing through the editing process, he has blue eyes. I just mark that down. And sometimes I will write them down in physical notebooks. So if I'm bored, if I'm in a car ride or something, I can just review it. But I really rely on my memory, which probably isn't the best, but it has not failed me so far. So I just keep rough notes.
You just keep those notes and you just go back and refer to them as you go. Now, do you ever build out those notes before you go writing, or is that kind of in line with the whole, plotting and such for you?
Exactly. I do not build them out beforehand, so that would waste a lot of time for me.
Very interesting. So one of the things that I find really cool is, as I'm learning this whole art of fiction writing, is tropes. You hear tropes thrown around so much. I was like, oh my gosh, what are tropes? And I'm like, oh my, that's what it means. What are some tropes you love using in your work and that you go to maybe on a frequent basis?
Honestly, I have not really been paying attention to tropes in my stories. Normally, I write the story and then I go back and I identify the tropes, and I was like, oh, hey, I did that. But I break the trope so much that I try to not use it as a guide at all. So, but with Lovecraft, I'm really struggling because the Lovecraftian trope is the sense of dread about the unknown. Not it's really hard to voice the Lovecraftian trope in words because it's more of like a feeling you get when you read something Lovecraftian. And I'm actually struggling a lot to include that in my book because I do have hope, I do have positive stuff in my books, but trying to work that in there, it's very difficult. And for an audience who loves Lovecraft, I know they're expecting that, so I have to put that in somehow. For my my retelling about the Book of Job, that was actually very easy because the Book of Job itself is very cosmic horror-ish. So, why is all that, like, it's very difficult to describe the feeling of cosmic horror, and I think I won't even attempt to try to put it into words. But with my urban fantasy, I happened to have sort of like a hint of a love triangle because it has some paranormal romance in it, and I didn't stick with the romantic trope though, because at the end they split apart, and people do not like that when it comes to romance. And when you look at the book covers, they look like a paranormal romance, and I have had I had a reader read the first book, and she sent me an email saying she loved the story but she hated the ending. And so I know a lot of people are probably feeling a lot of people are probably feeling the same way. And the third book, it really destroys the happily ever after. So it's more of a Wuthering Heights type of ending, maybe.
Is this something that you're artistically sticking to your guns on? Like, this is my creative vision. I don't want to go for the age-old trope.
I am very stubborn. I am trying very hard to satisfy my audience while not compromising on my artistic vision. And so far, it's doing okay. So I haven't had too much of a blow, like an explosion in my face with my urban fantasy. That series has actually been selling on its own decently, and it's been rated very well. When I try to stick to the tropes, people are not as satisfied with my work, or it's a lot harder to sell.
So it almost feels like it's forced for you to try to, cater to that trope rather than your creative vision then.
Yes, yeah.
Very interesting. Now, you have such a prolific backlog of books. It's just absolutely impressive. I mean, you've been in this business for a handful of years, since 2017, am I correct?
About, yeah. I started publishing in 2015, but most of my early stuff did not survive because it was garbage. So in my research, I wasn't entirely wrong. So what is your writing habit like? Are you doing something daily, weekly? Is there minimums that you shoot for? Every day as soon as I wake up, before I do anything else. Well, I eat breakfast, but that is my writing time for about 2 hours. Because my head is at its clearest then. I don't have the day's chaos in my mind pushing out the creativity of my story. And later on in the day, after I do some things like shower and do some errands and stuff like that, I might dedicate my day to editing my book. But most of it is in the early morning when everything is quiet. And now, though, my life's about to get really crazy, so I'm gonna probably have to maneuver because life is always shifting. It's always shifting around. So I do what I can when I can, but I make sure I write at least every day, even if I didn't have that special morning time.
Yeah. Is there any specific number of words that you do per day, or is it like a time that you set yourself?
If I'm writing a first draft, I try to hit at least 2,000. If I can hit between 3,000 and 5,000, I'm extremely happy with that.
And you're extremely good too. That's awesome. So that's really cool. All right, as we start to wrap up today's podcast, I've got the question I give everybody. What advice can you give to aspiring authors and self-publishers out there?
Don't do what I've done. So take the advice from all the authors that you can. When you have a question, take all of the advice and use what works for you. So even if there is a hard and fast rule that seems to work 90% of the time, if something is telling you to try to break it, go ahead and try to break it. But don't follow what I do religiously. Don't follow what somebody else does religiously. But try everything, find what works,